Welcome. Today I'm going to give you a quick, well, it's not going to be that quick. It's probably going to be a long program, but I'm going to give you a quick tour of cycles and an introduction to how they work. And these are cycles of history. So you've probably heard the term history repeats. Well, it does, but it never repeats exactly the same way twice. You have different players. For example, I often say that Donald Trump is very much like Henry VIII. He lived in a very similar time with similar things going on. And in fact, if you know that, you can predict the future in terms of how things are going to affect Donald Trump and how they're going to affect what is going on in the world. For example, we have right all across the world right now with this pandemic we've got a lot of authoritarianism, tyranny. We have all these crackdowns happening. It's very warm and dry. And we have weak leaders just about everywhere right across the world. And there are a number of other traits that you find at the top of very warm, dry cycles every 500 years. If you know that, and you know, obviously you know when you're alive, but if you know about cycles and you know about history, you can use the past cycle to predict what's going to happen in the future. In fact, what's going on right now in the world in 2020 was predicted over 100 years ago. And so you can do the same sort of thing. So I'm going to try and give you an idea as to how that works in this presentation. One of the key phrases that I usually use when I do some of these presentations are those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And that was a phrase that's quite well known by George Santayana. It is so true, I can't tell you, and the thing that we've learned about history is nobody pays attention to history, and you should. And in fact, there's a gentleman that did that, Lee Iacocca. There's many people, many luminaries understand the future, and the future tends to come back. It comes around again, and if you know where you are in the cycle, you'll know whether you're going to be having good times or bad times, whether it's the right time to buy a home, for example, and get yourself into debt, or whether it's better to rent. Those types of things are what cycles tells you. So Lee Iacocca worked at Ford Motor Company in the 1960s, and he's the guy that invented the Mustang. And that has gone on and on and on. I think it's the biggest selling car in history. He went on to Chrysler in the 1980s and turned that company around. They were having lots of trouble. So he said, as far back as I can remember, I've always been a strong believer in the importance of cycles. You better try to understand them because all of your timing and all of your luck is tied up in them. I think that is so true from my experience. So let's go look at a cycle. You know that the moon goes around the Earth in 27.3 days. And when you get a full moon, that's about every 29 days, any policeman or nurse will tell you that people go absolutely crazy. It is a wild couple of days whenever there's a full moon. And you can see the same thing in the stock market. I analyze the stock market daily, and whenever we have a full moon, typically the market will go up. And it's what is called an excitability index. At least this gentleman thought so, Alexander Shazevsky. He was a Russian scientist that lived in the late 1800s and into the mid-1900s. And he studied the sun for most of his life, did a tremendous amount of writing about the sun, and he found that mass excitability index with the sun as well. Stalin didn't really like what he was talking about and the kinds of things he was saying, so he threw him in the gulag for 8 years. So this guy had a very tough life. It's like the truth. Some people just don't like the truth. I know all about that. In any case, he studied the sun and sunspots, and he determined that the sun goes through cycles. Now, it's interesting that the sun is 400 times larger than the moon, and it's also 400 times further away. So you can think of the influence of the sun somewhat the same as the moon, although the sun with its heat has a lot more influence on the Earth. But they both give out electromagnetic rays, and electromagnetic rays also affect us, and I'm going to be talking more about that as this presentation goes on. But here are sunspots, and right at the moment we don't have very many sunspots in the sun, and that has been a concern because when you get a whole bunch of them at the top of one of these 11.2-year phases, that's the cycle of a solar maximum cycle, or the solar cycle, I suppose you could call it. When you get a lot of these sunspots right at the end of the cycle, it means that it's going to get colder. And we had that over the last few years. We haven't had any sunspots in the last year or so, and that tells scientists that the sun and the earth is going to get cooler. So we're going into what we would probably refer to as a mini ice age over the next 500 years. So that's something that you need to be prepared for, and that's something that cycles will tell you. It's going to get colder and drier. Food is going to be a bit of a problem going forward, and we need to prepare for that. But if we go look at these cycles a little bit further and look at this mass excitability index, I had said that there's an 11.2-year cycle with the sun, and that's the solar cycle, and every 11.2 years the sun gets very, very active, and you can see these spikes. This is the year 2000, and you get very wild things happening, but on a much grander scale than the moon. For example, at this high here, this solar cycle high from about 2000 to 2004, we had all kinds of plane crashes. We had buses falling off mountains. There was a market top up in here, the 2001 what do they call it, the dot-com phase, and so we had a market top there, and then it came down. We had the Concorde crash was in this period. A lot of airlines came down. We had the beginning of the Iraq War. Those types of things happen, and they typically happen around the top of these cycles. Now, if I was to go back 11.12 or 11.2 years back, there was a cycle around 1969. And at the top of that cycle, we had Woodstock, and I was at Woodstock, and so you could see on that cycle a very clear spike, and at the top of that spike was the Woodstock celebration with 250,000 people. Going back and going another 11.2 years from 2000, we get to 2010 through 2014, and you can see we had a spike here, the Sandy Hook, Kenya murders, bus crashes were in here, the Syrian conflict we had. It didn't happen in here when there wasn't any very active sun. It happens at the top. Arab Spring started here and got more intense as time went on. Flight 370, Korean Ferry, all of these things happened in this particular time frame, and that's the excitability factor that you'll get every 11.2 years. But now the sun is getting cooler. You can see that in 2014 this spike here wasn't as high as this one, and now we're getting them that are very much smaller, and that means that the sun is getting cooler. So we're not going to have as many of these crazy things happening because we're not going to have this excitability factor that is going to be as intense as it was in the past. Looking at the bigger picture, here's looking at 1700 through 2100, and the sun also has larger cycles where it gets hot. You can see it in here, hot, and then it gets cooler. Hot and cooler, and it'll do this over time. We've had a very hot spell over the last 100 years from about 1900. Well, this was a little cool and hot in here. And in fact, 1929 was a very, very cold year when we had the stock crash. And when we have very cold, dry years, you tend to get markets that go down in price. Well, here you can see we've had a big run, and now it's actually getting cooler, is what I was telling you in that last chart. And we're going to go into what we call this was the Maunder minimum, but a mini ice age, and it'll take about 500 years to get to the bottom of it, and it's going to be cooler. So your summers are not going to be as warm as they were. Winters are going to be cooler, and that's right across the Earth. So we had something called the Dalton minimum in here for a period of years, and the Maunder minimum went on. I'm going to come back to this when I talk about England. I'm going to give you some history of England and show you how things changed when it got colder and drier. And so that's what we're at, a very hot, dry period right now, and over the next few years you're going to notice it getting cooler and drier. And that's one of the reasons we have so many forest fires on the west coast of the United States right now. It's very, very dry, and it's going to get even drier. So that is an issue going forward. But that shows you a cycle, and if you know about these cycles, you can prepare for the future. Now let's take a quick look at where we're going. I always like to have a game plan going forward and for you to know exactly what that game plan is so that we're on the same page. A little bit about me. My background is that I was a television producer, writer, director for almost 50 years, and I had also during that time was a partner in a national advertising agency. So my background is primarily communication, and that's what I have done for most of my life, is taking very complex subjects and trying to make them very simple. So this is the same sort of thing I've been doing for about 50 years. I got involved, or interested, I guess, in the stock market about 15 years ago, about 2005, maybe a little bit before that. And it's interesting that most people that latch onto cycles get there through the stock market, because the stock market actually moves in a very predictable manner, and it has its own set of cycles that it works with, and it moves to those cycles. And if you understand those cycles, and we call them waves, and how the waves move and the order and the different patterns, you can trade the market quite profitably. So that's what I do on a daily basis now. I call the market or analyze the market for my clients. So it's given me a good basis for the cycles area of what I do. The major cycles, we're talking about historical cycles. I was for about a year the executive director of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, which was created in 1942 by Edward Dewey. And I'll introduce you to him here shortly. So for the last 15 years, I've been very much specializing in cycles of all kinds. And I would say I'm probably one of the more preeminent experts on cycles that there are in the world. So I'm going to take you through climate. That's really one of the cycles that really began this process, and a gentleman called Dr. Wheeler was key in that area, understanding that climate also runs in cycles and that a lot of history runs with those climatic cycles. So we're going to get into that and talk about that. And I'm going to take you through about 3 periods of time. I'm going to go back to ancient Greece. We're going to go visit Rome, the top of the Roman Empire. And we're going to look at England as well in the 1500s, Henry VIII up to Elizabeth I, and show you how that pattern coincides with the pattern that we have today. And if you look at that pattern, you can see where we've been is very similar to what happened in England in the 1500s, and where we're going is very similar to what England went through in the 1600s. And so these patterns, these cycles keep recurring, and that's the magic. And I want to show you that, and then you'll understand, I think, where we are today. One of the major cycles is the 172-year cycle, and that's actually a conjunction of a couple of planets, Neptune and Uranus. And I'm going to talk about this as a key cycle, but it just brings in the influence of the planets, because all of these cycles come from the planets of our solar system, both the sun and the other planets. And that's the reason that they are in cycles, because the planets never change their rotations and their cycles, and it's the same thing over and over again based on the combinations of how these things conjunct and how they pass each other and the direction they're moving in relationship to the sun. Then I'm going to touch on that's really part 1 that I'm going to go through, and it's a fairly intense portion of this presentation. And then I'm going to get into the stock market, which I might make part 2, and how that is looking going forward, because we have all of these things, climate, the stock market, the mood of, I call it the herd, but the mood of the population also moves in conjunction with these cycles. So, for example, you can tell what kind of films are going to be predominant, or the ones that are going to be the most favorable in a downturn. And we know that those are horror movies, and you're going to see an awful lot of horror movies do very, very well going forward. In each of these 172-year cycles, and even 100-year cycles, is that we have a golden age, an age, for example, in the 1960s, where we had all this great music, the Beatles and all the other musicians around them that came up with some terrific music. And you can go back to the early 1800s and you see Beethoven and all the great composers of that era. That was another golden age. And they come at particular times in a climate cycle. So it's really interesting to know that. I'll get into inflation, deflation, money, and gold, because these all have specific cycles that they work in, and they go up and down based on those cycles. And you're going to find that that's really, really important going forward, because if you have any sort of net worth, you want to make sure that you keep it. And we're going into a deflationary period over the next 20 years, so you need to understand deflation. I'm not going to get into that in any great degree here, but I'm just going to show you when it actually happens and what happens to your money and gold. Then I'm going to talk about the monetary system and central bankers, because that's the real fear right now, and I'm not going to tell you much more than that until I actually get into it. But understanding the role of central bankers in our economy around the world will tell you an awful lot about what is going on today. Then I'm going to touch on the Thrive Academy, which is my website at thetruthsage.com, where if you want to become a subscriber, you'll learn much more about this and how to stay safe over the coming 20 to 30 years as this economy starts to degrade and come apart, and we see the end of the American empire, which, you know, the empire of the day always ends when you get colder and drier climate, and we're going into a colder and drier climate, so the American empire is already starting to self-destruct, and you can see that the corruption is starting to show up, and all the truth always comes out at the tops of these cycles. So that's where I'm going to take you, and it's going to be a kind of an interesting session here, and it gets kind of deep, and it's going to be a little longer than I'd like, but of course you can come back and stop and start this. And I'm doing this in sort of sections for you so that it's not too much at any one particular time. The gentleman who I consider to be the father of cycles, it was Edward Dewey, and he was alive in the late 1900s. I consider Edward Dewey to be the father of cycles, and he was alive in, or he certainly was born just before 1900, and lived till about 1978. Many of the people that were involved in the understanding of these cycles during the 1920s and 30s really began their careers at that time. There was a big interest in cycles in the 30s, 40s, and 50s because people wanted to know why they had the stock market crash. And as a matter of fact, there were crashes every 20 years during the 1800s. So Dewey had actually worked for President Hoover in the U.S. in the finance department, and Hoover, after the 1929 crash, because of course he lost his position as president in 1930, wanted to know why these cycles seemed to appear every once in a while, because they had so many in the 1800s. So Dewey took it upon himself to leave the government, and when he did that, he got involved in trying to find out where these cycles came from and why cycles are cycles, to put it very bluntly. He wrote a number of books on this. The most probably popular one, or well-known, is The Science of Prediction, but there are about 3 other books that he wrote. He found about 3,500 different cycles, and there are some that are more influential in terms of their influence on human beings, so I'm going to stick with those, and they came from a gentleman called Dr. Wheeler, but he also discovered those same cycles. So there are an awful lot of luminaries during that period that wrote an awful lot of books. There's a lot of material on cycles out there, and what I'm doing is I'm taking a lot of the work of these luminaries and putting them together, because nobody's really put together the big picture as to how all of these cycles work and how they pertain to our life on Earth, and how we can now predict the future based on the past if you understand the cycles. So this kind of puts it all together, and Dewey is a very important figure, and he founded in 1942 the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, which I was the executive director of. I think it was in 2016 for a year. So his history goes way back. back. The next gentleman I want to introduce you to is really one of the key figures in cycles, and that was Dr. Raymond H. Wheeler. Now, he worked at the University of Kansas. He was the professor there, a PhD in psychology, and he wrote a number of books on psychology, so he's published in that area. But midway through his career, he really got involved or interested in how climate influenced human beings and started to do a study on climate. And I learned about him through my work with cycles, because he is cited in a number of books on cycles as being one of the more important figures. But he never actually published his work in climate, even though he had 200 people working for him at one particular time. And what he did was he put together a large book, and I'll just take you through this. This is actually a book, Climate, The Key to Understanding Business Cycles, written by the head of the American Stock Exchange, Michael Zahorchak. And so this was using a lot of Wheeler's notes and his work, but Dr. Wheeler didn't actually write a book himself. He had one that is actually sitting in Baruch College in New York, that is not fully published, but it's a draft, and I've gone through 2 of his drafts, and I have copies of all of his charts on climate, so it's really quite spectacular. But here's his book. He worked on a book called The Big Book, and it is about 2,000 pages. If you open it, it's about 7.5 feet wide from one end to the other. If you were to open it across this counter, this is what it looks like inside. So he wrote a lot of this in his own handwriting, and you can see the green letters here, or green text, has to do with cooler weather, and warmer weather is in the warm text. So he went back. The main portion of his work is from 600 BC through to about 1942. He goes back a little bit further than that. Actually, he goes back into the Egyptian empires, but a lot of the work there in climate is a lot sketchier. The main work that he did was 600 BC through to the 1940s. And so all of that information is here. I've gone through a lot of it, and it's quite spectacular. He did charts of all of the climate, both the temperature and the rainfall, from 600 BC right up to the 1940s. So I have a lot of those charts. Here are just a picture of his books that he was writing and just never got published. It was interesting that when he died, or before he died, he talked to his wife, and he was somewhat disappointed that he'd never published anything with all of the work that he'd done, about 20 to 30 years of work in the climate area. And as I said, he had 200 people working for him at one time. And he told her to burn all of his work, and my goodness, thank God she didn't, because it is still, took me about 2 years to actually find the big book, but it's at Baruch College in New York City, and it's an amazing, he's quite a brilliant man, an amazing amount of work. You can see one of his charts here, which I've taken most of his charts now, and I have upgraded them to make them more colorful and brought them into today's digital environment. So if we go back to what he came up with, it really works from the cycles that we have during a year. And you know these cycles. They're spring, summer, fall, and winter. You can always count on them. Each one of them is about 3 months long. They vary a little bit, but we have spring that is warm and wet, and then you have summer that gets drier, but it gets hotter and drier. Then you have fall, and it gets cool and wet. And then you have winter that gets cold and dry. So these are important elements of climatic cycles, and they also tell you a lot about what is going to happen in society. So cold weather gives you energy. Dry weather is drought weather, and that has a problem. We have problems with food during dry weather. Wet is prosperity, so you always have major empires growing when it is very wet and it is warm. And when it gets hot, people get lethargic. So between cold with energy and hot with lethargic, it tells you an awful lot about what is going to happen. Now, that is in a normal year. But what he found out is that these things go on a much grander scale in terms of time. But the same the same attributes of each of these different seasons work for these larger cycles. So there are actually cycles, if you go down here, of you can think of the year having 3-month cycles for each one of the seasons. You actually have 25 100-year, 500-year, and 1,000-year cycles. There's actually another one in here of 172 years, which I mentioned to you, and that's a very important cycle as well. And the cold and dry, when it gets cold and dry, you have individualism, you have civil war, and anarchy. That is where we're going. So we're in it. We've had a very warm, wet, let's say from about 1940 or 1950 all the way up to about the year 2000, it has been warm and wet. So we've had lots of food, the economy has grown, the stock market has gone up, all of those good things have happened. But now we're going to turn and go into a cold, dry climate for the next 500 years. It's going to gradually get colder and drier. And so we're going to get into this civil war, anarchy, a major revolution. There's going to be problems with starvation, and so it is time to start to pay attention to that, because we know that based on where we are, it's already starting to get colder and drier, and we know what's happening with the sun that I already explained a little bit earlier. So that is not something we're going to get away from. Warm and dry, you get international wars and decadence. We've had that in the last sort of 20 to 30 years. And you get dictators showing up. So that's the period we're in right now. It is still warm and dry, and we're getting these dictators happening. You can see it in Australia right now. You can see it certainly in Canada. It's starting to happen, and that's not a good thing. And also in the UK, where you're getting lockdowns with this supposed pandemic that we've got. And so you can look at these, and if you know the cycle that you're in, it all starts to make sense. And they happen in a particular order. So cold and wet, you get improved health, economic prosperity, and so this is a really good time. So some of these are good times, some of them are bad times, and they happen in a particular order. So 90% of the best leaders happen when you move from a cold, dry to a warm, wet cycle. So this is at a cycle bottom. The worst leaders are where we are now, where you move from a warm, dry to a cold, dry climate. So we're going to cold, dry, and we're at warm, dry. And so that's just a little bit in terms of how this affects us humans here on Earth, and it's always the same. So if you look at these cycles, you can think of them as sine waves. And there are very small cycles. You can think of this as a seasonal cycle every 3 months. And then there are large cycles, 1,000 years, for example, and then there are cycles in between. The larger cycles trump or are more powerful than the smaller cycles. So they're kind of overarching. So, for example, if this is dry, a really dry cycle, and this is kind of dry, wet, dry, this will have an overall dry, where you'll have some wet in certain sections of it, and sometimes it will get extremely dry because of these smaller cycles. But this is the major cycle, and it's the same way all the way down. So here's gives you an idea of the major cycles, and I'm going to be talking about most of these going forward here, the 25-year cycle that we've got. For example, the top of the warm cycle was 1998, which is what Wheeler had predicted. He said around the year 2000 it's going to start to turn colder, and our climate in terms of the cold or warmth has really gone sideways for the last 20 years or so, ever since about the year 2000. Then you get a larger 100-year cycle. 172 years I had mentioned to you is Neptune and Uranus, their conjunction, and you always get a stock market crash 14 years after that conjunction. So really interesting. Some of these things you almost set your watch by, and some of them, because they're very 515 years, within this 5 years doesn't really make a big difference, but we're at a 515-year top at the moment, and so it is turning from the wet and warm to cold and dry. So we're sort of right about here right now, and you're going to see that things are starting to change. It's an interesting time to be alive, that's for sure. And where do these things come from? Well, of course, they come from the planets, these cycles. I talked about the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. It's every 171.4 years. And there's a very definite 172-year cycle. So that one comes from that. There's a 1,500-year cycle that is the conjunction of Neptune and Uranus and Saturn. So depending on where these planets are at particular times, you get these cycles taking hold, and they last a very long time. There's also a ratio. There's something called the golden mean. If you're in art, you know what the golden mean is, but it's the ratio of 618, 62%. You can think of it that way, and it's reciprocal of 38%. So 62 plus 38 equals 100 or 100%. And these two figures, or these two numbers, are all through the stock market. The other thing is, and when you get into the stock market and you see that all of your measurements for all of the waves in the stock market usually have a relationship to 62%, this comes from the ratio of the distances between the planets. So if you were to go measure all these distances between these planets and then average them, it comes to 0.618. So there's your influence on Earth, and it's through virtually everything. Our DNA has these same measurements in it. You would find that even our arms and legs have measurements based on this relationship to, for example, your elbow and the one part of your arm to the other part of your arm have these Fibonacci, call them Fibonacci relationships, but 62% is called the golden mean, and it's all through artwork, all through other technical aspects. It's how plants grow. It's through almost everything that happens on Earth. Now, Dr. Wheeler did his work by looking at tree rings and some of the, like the sequoias and those very large trees, the trees that are in Southern California. He went and worked with those. He had a team of us, had 200 people, and they went through all of these tree rings. They're very accurate. Each one of these rings would be a year. And of course, these trees get very, very large. And so they can go back and they can figure out whether it was a warm year, a cold year, lots of rain, that sort of thing. And by being very specific on that, they get a very accurate reading of the climate over a very long period of time. There's another process that does the same thing, and that's using ice cores. So you can go to somewhere like Iceland, for example, or Greenland, and you can drill way down into the ice and you can get these ice cores. And there is an element of oxygen that is in these that fluctuates based on whether it is warm or cold or whatever else is happening in the atmosphere at that time, and you can analyze these and get another very accurate representation of what the climate is over very long periods of time, hundreds of thousands of years. They go back a long, long time. So using those two methods, now Dr. Wheeler used the tree rings, and he also used a lot of data and information. For example, the Chinese, going back into 13,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, that sort of thing, used to record the climate. And so there are accurate records back then. There don't tend to be accurate records when we go into periods like the Dark Ages, and those tend to not be very good times that people keep records. So it's spotty, but you have tree rings all the time, and you have ice cores all the time. And so you can get a pretty good, accurate reading. This is looking at the climate. You can see this is my little sine wave down here, is to give you an idea that it does sort of go like a sine wave. And if you were to go back to the last glacial period, there were the ancient Egypt that came up here, and it was very warm during this period, and then it got very cold, and then there was a new ancient Egypt, New Kingdom, which was in a very warm period. But you tend to have these ice ages that happen here, and you can see my blue little half an egg to the bottom here, and there's another one here. This is the new one we're expecting, where you get very warm periods and then you get very cold periods, warm, cold, warm, cold. And at the tops of all of these warm periods, you get these empires. And it's always the empires that form when it is warm and wet, where you have lots of food, it's great weather, and once you get to the top and it turns cold and dry, they tend to self-destruct and go right back in. We call these little blue areas here dark ages and our ice ages. This one was the little ice age called the Maunder Minimum back in the 1600s, and we're going to touch on that when we get into England. And here we are today, where we have the modern warm period, and of course we got the empire of the day, which is the American Empire, which is starting now to fall apart, and we're going into another cold period. So these things go up and down, and so we had this great big climate scare, if you want to call it that, the man-made warming climate thing, and you find that humans, whenever it gets a little bit colder, like in the 1970s, it got cold and dry and the market didn't do well. People thought that we were going to go into an ice age then, and when you get these very warm periods, you find that people go off the deep end and they think it's going to keep going up and up and up forever, but it doesn't. They move in a sine wave, and this is the way the climate has always been, and gradually it is getting cooler. All right, the sun is getting cooler, and so some of these very deep cold periods are getting colder. So I don't really like what's going to happen in the next 500 years. But, you know, in your lifetime, you're not going to see that dramatic a change. But over the next 500 years, it'll finally get to a bottom in terms of cold. So that is what we're going to look at in a little more detail. I'm just going to take this section here, going from the end of the Egyptian kingdom, and I'm going to show you more in-depth pattern all the way up to today, and it won't go into this little blue area here, but it'll be up to the top of the American Empire. So here's what we have to start with. If you think about the temperature, this is the temperature pattern here that you're seeing over thousands of years. This goes back from about the year minus 2000 or BC, 2000 BC, up until about today, 2000. So it's about 4,000 years, so 2020, and this is the top of the American Empire. These cycles are about 1,000 years. In here, so you can see 1,000 years, 1,000 years, and these are highs in the temperature. All right, gives you an idea. We've always talked about Rome being very, very warm, for example, much warmer than it was today. Everybody thinks that this was some sort of anomaly when it got this warm. Well, no, it's actually cooler than it has been in the past, and that's what these come from ice cores. This is the GIS P2 data that in the 1990s, 3 countries got together and they went to Iceland and they did this drilling, and they came up with this pattern. Now, interestingly enough, Dr. Wheeler, when he did his tree rings, came up with exactly the same pattern. Now, his is much more specific in that his charts go for a period of about 100 years, some of them, and some of them 250 years, but it gives you all of these fluctuations, and they're exactly the same as what we have here. So these come from ice cores in the 1990s. Dr. Wheeler's work comes from the 1930s and from tree rings. And so there's 2 sources of data that are giving me exactly the same thing. And so when I move forward and I start to put in the various empires that grew up during this period, see, this is the same period of the warm temperatures up in here. So this is your temperature pattern, and you can see how this relates to ancient Egypt. It grew when it got very, very warm and then sort of self-destructed on the way down here. And classical Greece was in here. It was more just in this little area, and then this began because Rome took over Greece and conquered Greece, and so that became part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was very warm at the very top, and so there was a major empire, and then it just gradually fell apart as it got colder and drier, until eventually here's Rome burns. Hadrian's Wall was at the bottom. That was built to keep out the Huns, because they started to invade Rome, the Roman Empire, because it was so weak at that point. Then it got warm again, and we got the Mayan Empire, and then the Mayan Empire got cold and dry, and it fell apart as well. So it all has a lot to do with climate. The Viking Age, where it was actually in Greenland, they were growing trees, and there was grass there, and it was very, very warm. That's when the Vikings were. And of course, we have had it got colder and drier since then. So it's interesting to note, too, that each one of these periods takes about sort of 500 years. It took about 500 years to get to the bottom here, a little bit more than that, when it starts out very, very warm and gets gradually colder. You get to the bottom. It takes about 500 years. This one was shorter and didn't go as deep. So it just depends. This one, again, has sort of, we talk about this as kind of an A, B, C pattern, but it got cold very, very quickly, and then it got warm all of a sudden, and then got much colder. So the pattern changes in these areas that we tend to refer to as the Dark Ages, when it gets colder and drier and these big empires fall apart. Going to the next one, you can see I've put in a few key things that happened here. This was Sparta, the top of Sparta, about 600 BC and before that. Then we had Greece up in here, and we're going to go take a look at Greece. When you get these major empires building, you have international wars on the upside as they're growing. As it's warm and wet, you get international wars. You can think of the American Empire, and as it grew, we had world wars at the beginning of the 19th century, or 20th century, for example, and then we got into Vietnam War. There's been lately wars in Syria. There's Libya. All of these international wars happen on the front end of this. As the empire starts to self-destruct, you get civil wars on the downside. So you hear a lot of people talking these days about a world war. Well, no, we've already passed the point where we'd get a world war. We're now going to have internal wars, civil wars, and that's going to go on for quite some time. As this empire that we have, the American Empire, falls apart, and a new empire begins about 500 years later or 300 years later. So these things take time for new empires to start up, and they usually move from the west to the east and back again. So we will probably get China as being the next big empire, and it will last for quite a number of centuries. 2 to 3 centuries sort of thing seems to be about the norm. And that's what you get. Here is, I'm going to talk about these as we go. JC1 is Julius Caesar, who is at the top of the Roman Republic. And then you get Jesus Christ, who happened just as it got cold and dry right at the top. Now, it's interesting down here, Mohammed, which was the Islamic religion, was actually alive right after the top here of this temperature high. And this is Justinian, who was key to the resurgence of the Roman Empire. So he was a key figure as well. You always get great leaders, typically, excuse me, at the bottoms of these, and not so great leaders. This was an anomaly at the top here, and it tends to you get dictators at the top. For example, Julius Caesar declared himself a dictator, and then he got murdered by the Senate. You can think of Donald Trump in that certain position right now, because he's up against a lot of people trying to get him out of office, and it's really the same pattern that we're starting to see there as well. So I'm going to take you through some of these. Here's international wars. You can see here going up to the top. It's also interesting that before the top of the British Empire, you had the printing press, which was invented, and now we had, before the top of this pattern here, the American Empire, about 40 years ago, we had the internet that became all the rage. So these are free speech that started up because of the printing press and the internet. But at the tops of these cycles, free speech starts to get hit really hard, and so you're going to see this sort of, they call these the traits that you see at the tops and the bottoms of these cycles. They're all very different between the bottoms and the tops, and right now we're at a top and starting down the other side. So we're going to see civil wars going forward. We're going to have problems with food. It's going to get colder and drier. And we're going to get a whole bunch of other traits, which I'm going to take you through going forward. But if you know that, then you can prepare for it, and it helps you to understand what's going on in today's world. Now, the other side of the coin is that when it gets cold and dry, you tend to go into what we call dark ages. And so you can look at this original chart. You can see we have the Greek dark ages here. We have the dark ages in here as it gets colder that I've already mentioned. And we have what we called the Little Ice Age, which is actually another term for it was the Maunder Minimum, where it got very cold around 1660 into about 1700. And during those periods, what you tend to get is a lot of pandemics. So you can see that we had leprosy here when it was very cold. And in Greek times, we had the plague of Athens in this period. The Antonine plague, which was at the bottom of the Roman Empire when it got really cold and dry. Plague of Justinian. Justinian was in power at the top here, and as it got colder and drier, they had a big plague that killed millions and millions of people. These plagues always do. And then we had, of course, when we got into the British Empire and the Spanish Empire and those empires during this period where it got really cold into the Maunder Minimum, then you had Black Death, typhus, cholera, and influenza. Yellow fever, China plague, and smallpox was around 1835, which was another pandemic. And it was also a stock market crash in 1835. That was a 172-year top of a climate. And of course, when you have that, you always get a stock market decline, and that's exactly what happened. So it's not like the little pandemic we have now, which is the COVID, which is really not. It's very similar to an annual flu. And one of the other problems that you get as you get more into this, at the tops of these cycles, you also have very low birth rates. And we found out more recently in the last year or so that that equates to low testosterone. And with low testosterone at the tops of these, you get testosterone is the hormone within the human body that gives you the ability to think critically and make decisions, good decisions. When it's very low, you don't really have that ability. It's really impaired. And what takes over in terms of the hormone in your body is cortisol. And that leaves you very fearful and with anxiety. So right now what we've got is, excuse me, at the top of this particular market right now, we have a lot of fear, and we're up in here right now. We have a lot of fear, and we've got this little flu bug that is not any more powerful than getting the flu on an annual basis. It hasn't killed any more people than that, although the media is making it seem like it has. So that is the difference now. When you get real pandemics that kill millions and millions of people, then that's something you'll want to watch out for. And one of the things that I knew when this latest COVID pandemic came out onto the scene is that it came at the top of the stock market, and none of these pandemics ever come when it's warm and wet at the top. They always come when you're down at the bottom. So I looked at that and said, well, it's got to be man-made. And sure enough, we found out that it is man-made, and it came from China. And so it was really orchestrated, and that's something that you need to be aware of. But knowing about cycles will give you that idea of what is actually happening, what is real, and also what to prepare for as it gets colder and drier. Now back to our main chart of 4,000 years, and you can see the cycle tops here, and you can see the various kingdoms that arose during the warm times. Let's go look at one of them, and we'll start with classical Greece, which is right here. And you can see how we've got this warm period that sort of went up, and that was when Greece grew and actually had international wars where it would war with some of the other city-states, and then it fell apart on the downside. And then we had Rome, which actually conquered Greece just about at the bottom here of this cold spell at about 225 BC, and then it warred and had international wars and grew an empire that was very, very large until it got to the top here, and then it turned cold and dry and started back down again. So we'll look at both of these. If you go look at the Greek city-states in that time, this was about 336 BC. Here they are, and you can see Sparta down here in this sort of blue color that doesn't stand out very much from the background. But Sparta at about the 600 BC was the most powerful city-state in Greece in this, with all the city-states. And then they had in the 400s BC a gigantic earthquake that they never really recovered from. And so as Greece, or as Athens, was growing, Sparta was actually starting to fall apart, and its heydays were over. At the same time, we had the city-states of Greece, and it was kind of a loose group of cities that sometimes warred with each other, and that was one of the issues that they had. Here's Athens right here, there's Thebes, and some of the other city-states you would know of, Olympia. Macedon was a very powerful country, and at the top of the Greek, and I'm going to show you this, the Greek warm period, when it was at its height, Philip II from Macedon decided to go over to Greece and actually warred with Athens and conquered Athens. And let's go now and look at the climate charts to show you what they looked like at that time. So here we are at 500 BC, all the way over to 225, and about 225 is when Rome came in and took over Greece. But what you're seeing here is some of Dr. Wheeler's charts, which I have brought up to date, showing you the temperature in red, and you can see how it went up to the top of the Greek Empire and then started to go down again, and it got cold and dry, and you get civil wars when it gets cold, and you get a thriving empire when it is at a height. And this is, the green line is rainfall, and there's a little anomaly here that this didn't match some of the other information that Dr. Wheeler had, so he made a note that these tree curves don't agree at this point. It probably just went sideways like this, but it was very cool, it was arid in here, very dry during this period, and when you have that, you have civil wars. So we have I mentioned to you before that every 100 years or so has a golden age. And we had Pythagoras, and of course, you know, he looked at the world through math. And so we had these wonderful thinkers that kind of grew during this period and all the way into Pericles. And Pericles was a statesman, he was a general, and he was one of the people instrumental in developing democracy, and that became the political basis for Greece as it grew. So as it got warmer and wet, and there was lots of food, other Persians and Carthaginians grew up, so you had other empires that grew. The Mayan Empire at this time, and grew, of course, later on in the about 1400s, I think that was, and also the 600s. You had the Mayan empires. So some of these would grow and be very powerful during the warm, wet period, and then they would fall apart when it got colder and drier. So Philip from Macedonia came down and conquered Greece just about in this time frame as it started to get cold and dry, and that was about 338, and he died a couple of years after that. And Alexander the Great was his son. He was about 20 years old, and he took over Greece, but he started warring, and he was a great general. In fact, he never lost a battle in his entire life, but he started at 20 and actually died at 32. So he didn't last all that long, but he conquered Persia. And if you go back to our map, you can see Persia here. He went into Egypt, he went into Africa, and he also went into India. So he did very, very well and captured all these territories and grew this fantastic Greek empire. But when he got to India, it's already getting colder and drier, and bad things start to happen. Got into India, and his generals and army underneath him didn't like being on the road for so long, and they rebelled. and he lost his life in one of the battles, and the generals split up all of the territories, and it all fell apart. And so that's the sort of thing that tends to happen no matter what is going on, is when it gets colder and drier, you get empires that start to fall apart. And that's what happened with Greece until we get into about 225. They had civil wars with amongst some of the other city-states until it was taken over by Rome. So if you go over and look at Rome, so I showed you 225 here. This is a 172-year cycle. This was another 172-year cycle over here, and you can see that down here. And this was a very important 515-year peak, which is 3 times 172. So every 172 years, or every 3 172-year periods leads to a 515-year high. And that's what we're at right now. In fact, the high was in 2007 in the period that we're in. And that's a very much more powerful cycle top. And so that's what we had here with the ending of the Greek Empire. So if we go over to Rome, here is 225, right actually it's over here. Rome defeats Greece. I guess it was a little bit later than that, at about 150 BC. And they had civil wars, and there was a Greek rebellion in here. And it's just a very unsettling time whenever it is cold and dry. Then, of course, Rome grew, and you have all the imperialistic wars in here, and they grew. Many countries conquered countries. Pompey was a general that was very popular in those days, and he actually vied with Caesar for the dictatorship when we got to the top here. And Julius Caesar was in 49. He ruled from 49 to 44 BC, and of course he declared himself a dictator. So at the tops of these cycles you get, and you can think of Trump that way, some people think he's a dictator, but you get this authoritarianism, and you can see that all over the world right now as it's very warm and dry. Think about what is happening in Australia, where they've locked down, this Dan Andrews has locked down Victoria, one of the states of Australia, and he is being authoritarian, and they've got people can't go more than 5 kilometers from their house, and they can't be out at night. I think they've relaxed that a little bit, but it is very authoritarian, very tyrannical, and that's the kind of thing that you're getting now when we're at the top of this warm, dry cycle. You also get, there's other traits that you get. There's always a lot of homosexuality. You can remember the Roman baths were very big in here. There was also a call for more people for people to have more kids because they had very low birth rates, and so that's part and parcel of this testosterone thing. So there ended up being a lot of fear as we go into the colder, drier periods. And of course then you start to get migrations, you get invasions, and you start to get civil wars. They also had things like the games, the Colosseum, and you know that they used to have, of course, lions and tigers, and they would have those games that went on. I always think about it at the top of these cycles, very much like the NFL. They have major sporting events, and that was the Colosseum in those days. And we have sort of the NFL and so hockey and some of the other big sports that are at their peak right now, and of course starting to fall apart. So we had Jesus Christ that was alive from 4 BC to 30 AD, and that usually happens because we had Muhammad in the 800s or 600s, I guess it was, and he appeared with the Islamic religion right after the top, just as it starts to get cold. So this is a little inference from Wheeler in terms of Christ appeared here, and I put this picture up here so that you would know that he was at this particular time. There was another dictator after Caesar, and what happened with Caesar, of course, he called himself dictator, and then all of the other senators were very jealous of him. They had stolen their power. He had stolen their power, and they assassinated him. And you've got the same sort of thing if you think about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the U.S. with Trump. They're trying to remove him from office. This also happened in England with Queen Elizabeth, and we will get to that shortly. So this is a similar trait that happens at the tops of all of these cycles. So you have tyranny, corruption, and it ends up in civil wars. So after Caesar was killed, there was a civil war here. There were other civil wars and a plague, the Antonine Plague, which I mentioned to you in here, and then it got warm, and we had a good dictator. Oh, here's one more. Domitian was a dictator from 81 to 96 AD, and he was tyrannical, authoritarian, and he referred to himself as God. So you tend to have these types of rulers. They're also very weak rulers, and they rule by decree, and everybody else has to do what they say, and there's no democracy at the tops of these empires when it is warm and dry. And then you move on to cold and arid, and you get civil wars that happen in here. They also devalued their money on the downside, and you get that's called inflation. Whenever we have inflation, it's devaluing your money. So there are certain traits that happen at the tops of all of these cycles. They're exactly the same. You can pretty well set your watch by them when you get at the tops of them, and we're seeing that same sort of thing happen today. Now, it's important to understand inflation, at least the basics of it. So here is a look at the coins of Rome, and this goes from the 240s. So this was around in this era here from 240 CE or AD down to about 270, down just in this area. So just this area here, as it was getting colder and drier, a lot of the dictators of Rome took the coinage and took the silver out of it, and that's inflating the coinage. It's the same thing we do today with interest rates, and what happens is when you inflate, there's more of this money out there, but they take the silver out, which then reverts back to the government, and the population then gets these coins with less silver in them. So here we have in 240 AD, we had 40% silver in these coins, and then they went down to 30%. 10 years later down to 20%, 270s down to a little less than 5%. So you can see how these coins really have gotten worse and worse and worse, and what these, call them politicians if you like, but these emperors would do is they would rob the population of their money, and the same thing has been happening over the last 100 years in the US and Canada and all of the nations of the world, in that our money has been inflated and it is worth much less. I'm going to touch on inflation going forward when we start to talk about England, but this same trait happens throughout these empires, and as they grow to be warmer and drier, that's exactly what happens. This happened on the downside, which is a little different than what has happened in the last 100 years here. We have had inflation on the upside, but primarily you get inflation on the upside as these empires are growing, and then you get deflation on the downside. So you're going to see this theme occur as I talk about England, as I talk more about today. It's a really important concept to understand, and I have other videos that I produced that help you understand what happens to your money when it's inflated away, and then on the flip side, when you go into deflation, as it tends to get colder, your money actually becomes more valuable. So it's important to understand that element of it, and part of what I do in my Thrive Academy is try and teach that concept of money and how to stay safe and how to keep your wealth, because that's really important as our money changes over time. Now back to our main chart. So we've left behind Greece and Rome, and I want to go look at another period of time just in this area in here. So if I move you ahead, you can see that I put a square, or a rectangle I guess, around this period from the top of, let's call it the Norman Conquest, when we had the Norman Empire. Remember 1066 that we all learned about when the Normans conquered England? Well, we're going to start there, and we're going to look at this getting cold and dry for this period. This is about 500 years. Actually, it's longer, because it started at about the 1066 time frame and went all the way to about 1700. It's almost 700 years where it just got colder and drier until we had the Maunder minimum way down at the bottom, and that was when the 13 colonies in the United States, in America, were founded. And then we started going up again in warmth and wet, and we grew this great big American empire. So we'll go take a look at this and all the things that happened there and look at some more traits. So if we go back to one of Wheeler's charts, and you can see that we've got the temperature here in red and it's rising, and we've got the rainfall usually rises with the temperature. It usually follows temperature, but it goes up and down in a sort of sine wave with, up and down with the temperature. So here's the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and this was a rising temperature. So we've got an expansion of all of these different empires. The Normans, they were growing their empire, and that's where they took over England. And so you have a number of them, and these all happen at the same time around the world. So you've got the Chinese, the Persians, the Tartars, and in various places in the world, all these empires are growing and expanding until we get to the colder, drier period, and they start to fall apart. And then you go into civil wars. The other thing that happens is you get these crusades, and they happen when it gets cold and dry typically, so colder periods, and that is very similar to the migrations that we are getting, that we've had in the last few years, because all of Europe and into Scandinavia and even England has had all of these migrations from places like Syria, from Africa, and some of it has to do with finding food, a lot of it finding food. And in the US right now, you're finding a lot of people are migrating from the cities out to the country, and that has to do with staying safe and also getting closer to food. And going forward, when you get into these colder and drier periods, when you have starvation and you have problems with food, we don't have as many problems as they used to have in the olden days, because in these days they didn't really have a good way to store grain. So when they got really hit with some bad climate or weather in about 4 years in a row, it ruined the crops and it left everybody in dire straits. So those are some of the things that you tend to get when it gets colder and drier in here. And it goes on for a long period, and you get civil wars constantly. The other thing that happens, when I mentioned when it gets warm and dry and you get these empires that crop up all at once, you get these tyrannies and authoritarian leaders. They're weak leaders, but they rule with an iron fist. On the downside, you move towards democracy. So John I and Henry II started up common law, for example, and that happened in a cold, dry period. Also Henry III here with the Oxford Parliament. So they went to parliaments and more democracy, getting away from kings and queens. And of course the Magna Carta, which was sort of forced on Henry. The people start rebelling and you have civil wars, and so that was the Magna Carta in 1215 in a cold, dry period. And the Magna Carta was, of course, they couldn't lock people up without a trial, without a good reason, and so that was moving towards democracy, and you tend to get these sorts of things. Then it got warm in here and wet, not a huge one, because here's a huge one, and we had a golden age. So this was scholasticism and learning, and we had a small Mongol empire in here that grew up and was very powerful. And then we also had in the Golden Age a lot of cathedrals being built, a lot of paintings. It was a very artistic period in here. And these crop up for periods of maybe even as long as 100 years, but they tend to happen with all of these people coming out and being very artistic at the same time. You can think of the Renaissance was a period when you had the Michelangelos and those types of people with their sculptures and their artwork, and the Sistine Chapel, and all of those things happened in a golden age at a specific period of time. Now, moving on along my timeline here, and we've just moved a few years ahead, you can see here's my Magna Carta I showed you in 1215 right there, and then we had this Golden Age, which I explained, the scholasticism, and we had all these cathedrals, and then it got cold and dry again, so we have this sine wave sort of thing happening here where it gets cold and dry, and then it gets warm and wet, and then you go up and down like this. Here's another 172-year cycle, top we'll call it, where the cycle then, and sometimes you don't exactly, well, very often you don't get the highs of the temperature and wetness right on the cycle, but they very often get very close. But you always have at the ends of these cycles, most countries get themselves into a bankruptcy situation. And that's what we have right now. We are at the top. This was a 172-year cycle, so it wasn't as large as the cycle we're in right now, which is a 1,030-year cycle and also a 515-year cycle at the top in 2007. We have more debt in the world now than we have ever had in history. This is not a good thing, and we're going to have a lot of banks that are going to go bust. We are going to change our financial system over the next 10 to 20 years completely, because the one that we have now is all based on debt, and it works for the central bankers, but it doesn't work for anybody else. It works for governments because governments love to inflate. And that's exactly what happened here. And we had the Siena banking crisis, and Siena being in Italy, and this went over a period of about 50 years where we had one bank. And these were houses, banking houses, that just cratered one after another. And what they would do is they would lend money to governments, and governments would go bankrupt and not be able to pay back their bills, and they would go under, and so would the banks. So it ended up being the Florence banks that were in the about 1330, and you'd find out that every 10 years there would be a series of banks that would go under. And then we got the Black Death. And this was another warm, moist period, but it wasn't all that warm, and so we ended up getting a Black Death here and then 100 Years' War. And I have to realize where we are. We're actually in 1350, we're down in this area in here. So it's already been getting very, very cold. And you can see that we're at the bottom, but we're near the bottom, but we're not at the ultimate bottom in terms of the cold. So while you see these little ups and downs in terms of the temperature, it's actually quite cold overall. So you don't get you get large empires, but you still can have a lot of civil wars during this period and Black Death, and it just is in colder and drier periods, and civil strife, and you get peasant revolts. And we also had during this period in 1440 the Gutenberg Press. And this is also when you introduce more democracy as it gets colder. And one of the things that we have today, of course, is the internet. And this was just before the British Empire. You're starting to see it here. The British Empire ended up with Elizabeth I and Henry VIII, and all the Tudors was just starting up. And so the printing press allowed people to get more information in the English language rather than having everything in Greek or Latin, of course, which very few people would be able to read unless they were particularly well educated. So this opens up the ability for people to get more information, and it is really more democratic than anything. So you get these types of inventions that help the people in times of cold and dry. Moving over now, and you can see that the next period, and this is going into 1450 here, and I will just show you the next one we're moving to is 1500. So we have the English Empire, the absolute monarchy of Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled for almost 50 years. In the 1550s to 1603 is when she died. The weather, or the climate, started out cold and dry and then got wet and warm, and that's when this English Empire became more powerful. Now, the most powerful empire at this time was Spain, and it was going in through a period while England was rising, where it was falling somewhat, and Spain actually went bankrupt 6 times within about a 100-year period. Every 20 years, it would go like clockwork, it would go bankrupt. And the same thing happened in the 1800s, actually, where we had depressions every 20 years. So you get these patterns that repeat over and over and over. And one of the things that we have with the central bankers that we have now, and of course the Federal Reserve, is that they have taken charge and they have tried to even out those ups and downs where you have all of these depressions and stock market crashes every 20 years. But what they have done is they've created an even larger one with more and more debt than we've ever had before. And so the crash is going to be that much larger. So you can thank the central bankers and the current situation we have now. But this was the end of the feudal period. And after this, the financial system completely changed, and the Bank of England actually was begun right about 1696, right in here as it got colder and drier. So that was the banking system that began, and it's the banking system that started the central banks that we have now. So you can go back to 1500s, and we had this 172-year cycle top at 1492, and guess what? That was Christopher Columbus. So it sort of ended on a high as Christopher Columbus was out discovering America in this period of time. Then we had Henry VIII, and we had a golden age where we had Leonardo da Vinci. And golden ages tend more than not to come out of cold going to a warm period. So that's almost universal is when it happens. And we had Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, I mentioned them. In the 1800s, for example, early 1800s, when it was again coming out of a dry, cold period into a warm period, in about the early 1800s to 1835, there was another crash in 1835. But just before that period, we had 1800, we had Napoleon, and that was an expansionary time. And we also had all of the great composers like Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and all of those people all at the same time. You can go to another golden age that we've had in the 1960s, which were the Beatles and all of those great songs and music that came out of the 50s and 60s. That was another golden age, and we have one of those, as I mentioned to you, every 100 years. There isn't one coming up for quite a long time now. We had the bonfire of the vanities, which was, again, in a cold and dry time and at the end of a 172-year period. This was, you can think of it as losing freedom of speech. A whole bunch of people in Italy got together and burned lots of artwork and many, many books, and they were convinced to do that by the government. And that was really a time when you can look at that and say, well, that is a destruction of freedom of speech. And that always happens at cycle tops. Then we got into Henry VIII, and Henry VIII was at a time when he was fighting the Roman Catholic Church, and Henry VIII, of course, was really all about himself with his 6 wives, and he started the Church of England because he had a fight with the Pope, and the Pope would not allow him to have a new wife, and it would not annul the previous marriage. So he decided, well, I'm going to start the Protestant Church of England. And so that really was an underlying corruption that was going on all through this period, because we would have his kids who then came to power after him, and Edward, for example, was Protestant, and he kept the Church of England. Bloody Mary was Catholic, and when she got to power, it wasn't for a very long time. It was only for about 5 years, but she ended up burning 300 heretics at the stake. It burned them to death, and so that was her legacy. So you get these tyrannical people that get into power at the tops of these cycles when it gets very warm and this was warm and wet. It would start getting dry in here and start getting colder, and that actually happened after Queen Elizabeth died. So here was 1603, right about there, and you can see when it died it was warm a little longer, but it started getting cold. This is the warmth, the red line, and it was wet, but they started having plagues very, very quickly. It's interesting that Shakespeare was alive, of course, at this time, and all of his tragedies started as it got cold and dry here after Queen Elizabeth had died. He had a lot of comedies, and all of his other works were in this period when it was warm and dry, and they turned very dark when it started to get cold and dry. Then we had British civil wars. We had Galileo, and Galileo, of course, talked about the Earth not being flat anymore. And he had a career that lasted from 1564 in here till about 1642. But when he was talking about the Earth getting not being round, of course, he got locked up because that was against the church teachings, and that was in a cold, dry period. So it tends to be a period where the beginning of, which we're going into now, where you do have an awful lot of authoritarianism. You can't say anything outside of what the government believes. For example, Queen Elizabeth was somewhat of a tyrant as well. You could not publish anything in her day without it being blessed by the Queen. So it had to be approved or it could not be published, and the sort that lightened up as time went on. You also have a lot of palace intrigue at the tops of these as well, and it's a good example of that with Mary Queen of Scots, who had left Scotland, where she was actually the Queen of Scotland, and she had to leave Scotland. I'm not going to go into all the details because we don't have all day here. And she ended up moving to England, and she would have been next in line for the throne if Elizabeth didn't have any children. Well, Elizabeth eventually had her head lopped off like so many other people, but she was sitting in the background for a lot of the time that Elizabeth was in power, and there was a lot of corruption going on. There was a lot of people trying to overthrow Elizabeth, so all of this went on all through her career. Then we got into James I up here, 1603, after Queen Elizabeth had died, and that is, of course, the King James version of the Bible. You know, he's a very weak leader, though. And then the plague started down in here as it got colder and drier. And they went into British civil wars, which lasted for a good 10 years. And again, this is the kind of thing that happens whenever it gets colder and drier. You get big revolutions, and revolutions. There was the Glorious Revolution as well, but I guess I should lead up to that, where Oliver Cromwell took over power for a period of time in 1653, and actually he had beheaded Charles I and took over and became a dictator for that period, and dissolved Parliament, had his own Parliament, but he was really the dictator for a while, and that devolved into a civil war as well. During that period, in 1664, for example, we had the bubonic plague, fire of London in 1665, where all of London pretty well burnt to the ground. So bad things happen when it turns cold and dry. They always do. And then we had a little bit later on habeas corpus, so it started to move towards democracy with these civil wars and all the revolutions, because people rise up against their governments and they demand that they don't get locked up. And habeas corpus, of course, is you have to have a trial very, very quickly after you are accused. You can't just throw somebody in jail and let them lie there for months and months and months. You have to look after them very quickly. And also the Bill of Rights in 1689. So these things came in, and after one of these civil wars, we had the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution, there were revolutions during this period of 1988 to 89 all across Europe. Almost every country had a bloody revolution or revolution of some kind. The Glorious Revolution was a bloodless revolution in England, where the population asked William of Orange, William and Mary had been the daughter of Charles I, who had, of course, had his head lopped off, but they were in what we know as the Netherlands now, and they were the king and queen, and they asked them to come and be the king and queen of England. So there were revolutions all across Europe. You tend to get this when you go into cold and dry. We're going to end up with a revolution in many countries around the world as we have people that revolt against what's happening with the government, this authoritarianism. You get these revolutions that spring up like wildfire, if you want, during these periods of cold and dry. So that is going to happen. It is a given. It has happened every single time when you get a major cycle top that we had in 1664. And of course, this was in a very cold period. It actually ended up being the Maunder minimum starting about 1645 into the early 1700s, where it was very, very cold. And we're moving into that period, and that was, as I mentioned to you, the end of about 700 years. So here we are down at the bottom here with the Maunder minimum. Here was the British and Spanish empires just in here, and I've shown you what happened there. It got colder and drier. And then, of course, in 1492, we had America, I mentioned that got discovered, and gradually over time they started the 13 colonies that split from England and created a great big empire over time as it got warmer and wetter. And so I hope you can see by me taking you through some of these examples from history how a lot of these traits just happen over and over and over. So knowing this, you can tell what's going to happen next. And one of the things that's going to happen next, of course, is it's getting colder and drier. We know that. We are going to have real plagues happening, but probably not for the next 10 years. We're going to have a major stock market crash. We already have money that is worth next to nothing because it's been inflated, and I want to touch on that next. And we will be going into deflation, where all of our assets will be getting less expensive because our money now is going to start to become more valuable over time, over the next 5 to 10 years. So it's going to be tumultuous times. It's times that you have to pay attention to what is going on, the bigger picture. And so I'm going to get into that a little bit more going forward in the second part of this video. To finish up here, let's go back to the main chart, and I'll just give you a little bit of a summary as to where I've taken you. We talked about Sparta as being the main city-state in the 600 BC period, and of course it was starting to disintegrate when Greece started up. It was a city-state of Greece, but Athens really became the main city-state during that period. And we looked at what happened. It got warm and wet, and so you get the rise of empires, and then it got cold and dry coming back down, and Rome took over Greece. It conquered Greece, and Greece became part of the Roman Empire, and they actually brought democracy into the Roman Empire as far as it went. And they got Julius Caesar at the top here, and Jesus Christ, and it got colder and drier when Jesus actually came to life and started the Christian religion, and then it got colder and drier all the way down, and Rome started to fall apart. And it took a very long time for that to happen, and we got Rome burning at the bottom here as it got colder and drier. And Hadrian's Wall, they would get you get a lot of civil wars, but they'd also get the Huns, for example, which would invade Rome, and they were always looking over their shoulders at other empires which were trying to take the spoils from Rome as it was disintegrating. And then we went over and looked at the Norman conquest, and as it gets colder and drier, you still do have in these what we used to call the Dark Ages, but you still have these empires that spring up as it gets these warmer and wetter periods within the colder and drier periods. So that still goes on, and we will have those kinds of periods going forward. But we had a very, very dark period during this medieval warm period as it got colder and drier. Then we had the Renaissance, so you do have golden eras when it gets warm. So we had a little spike up here. It got warm and wet, and we had the Renaissance, and there were actually a couple of Renaissances in these periods. And so all is not lost when you're getting colder and drier, and you even go into the Little Ice Age where we had the 13 colonies that cropped up. But now we have the American Empire with all the international wars on the upside, and we will have all of the civil wars on the downside. So that gives you an idea of some of the traits, but let's go look at some of those traits in a little more depth. So when you get to a very hot period, which we're in right now, and it's starting to turn cold, these are the traits that you get. You get authoritarianism. You get a lot of government debt, which we've got. You get tyranny, and we move towards socialism away from democracy. Democracy doesn't start to, we don't move towards democracy until it starts to get cold and dry again. So that's one of the key traits that I'm sure you're noticing all over the place. You get riots, you get class struggles, poor versus the rich. We know today, as we had in England, as we had in Rome, those periods that I talked about, and even in Greece, where you have 1% are the rich and 99% are the poor, and it leads every single time to a revolution. And so we're going to have another one of those in countries across the world over the next 10 to 20 years, guaranteed. Civil wars, revolution, class struggles. I guess I've got that twice in there, but very true, and we're going to see a lot more of that. We're only seeing the beginning of it right now. Migrations. We've had some migrations, as I mentioned to you, in the last 10 years across Europe, from Africa and from Syria, and that is still continuing. But we're now getting a new migration from urban to rural, and you're starting to see that, and you're going to see more of that as people move away from cities, which are going to be increasingly unsafe, and you're going to be moving towards food and water. You wouldn't want to be somewhere like New York City, for example, when trucking companies are going under and food is not getting into the city and water is not getting into the city, and it becomes very difficult to live. And of course, once you get people that are hungry, they will do anything for food, so it becomes very unsafe in those cities. We're going to see that going forward. Then you get major stock market crashes, an economic meltdown, and deflation. Deflation is actually a good thing because it makes all our assets get less expensive, and so we can buy more with our money. So we're going to see that over the next while. Food shortages and starvation. We've already had major floods in places all across the world. We have had problems in Africa with I'm trying to think of what they're called, the insects that have taken over large portions of our Africa and destroyed crops, and so that is already starting. Pandemics later on as it gets colder, but these are going to be major pandemics, so you'll get the Ebolas and those types of things that will happen. So you need to learn to stay safe. It's not going to be anything like these little flu bugs that we've had this time through. Then you also have at the tops of these hot climates, you get weak leaders, corruption like crazy, and you can see that right now in the U.S. where they have got so much corruption. But the other interesting thing is that all of this comes out. All the truth typically comes out at the tops of these cycles, and that also leads to people revolting against government because they don't trust government anymore. You get lots of palace intrigue, and you're seeing that even in today's world. And propaganda, I mean, all of the major, in both in Canada and the US, the major mainstream media are all owned by either the government or some of these, like the George Soros of the world and the central bankers. So they're controlling the message, and that's one of the things that they do at these cycle tops. And then we also have a lower birth rate. You always get that, and we have the lowest birth rate probably in about 150 years, since the early 1800s, and that is low testosterone, and it leads to fear. And that's why there's been so much fear about what really is a flu bug. It's a cold virus that we've got, and it hasn't killed any more people than the annual flu, although the media has made it out to be very much more dangerous than it actually is. So that gives you, that's part one. And I'm going to go on to part two, where I'm going to talk about the markets. I'm going to talk a little bit more about inflation and deflation and central bankers, and really what is going on today and how you can prepare for what is going to happen over the next short while. And we know that because history repeats, but it doesn't always repeat the same way. The players are different, but a lot of the same traits happen as it gets warm and hot, and again as it gets cold and dry. And we, just knowing that, need to prepare for them. Now, if you're concerned about your future or your family's future, I've set up a new website called thetruthsage.com, where I'm providing, for a fee, an annual subscription, information on cycles, certainly, and there's more of that to come, even if you're not on the site. But the big thing that I'm providing is how to stay safe. We know we're going to end up in a huge revolution over the next 10 years, and we're going to have a stock market crash that is the largest crash probably in history, because we have the largest bubble in history economically. So that is something that you want to be careful about going into the future. And I explain, for example, I've got information on deflation, which you absolutely need to understand, because our money is going to become much more valuable compared to where it has been over the last 100 years. So you'll be able to buy more with it, but you need to realize that banks are not a safe place to keep your money. So all of the things I'm going to talk about is what's really going on in the world. The corruption around the world is absolutely incredible. We're going to see civil wars all over the world. And that happened at the end of Rome. It happened at the end of the English or British Empire. It really was England at that time. Governments aren't telling you the truth. Governments never do. They always lie. And I've even written up blog posts on 300 years of lies ever since the 1600s. It's been lie after lie. And we've had an awful lot of them in the last 100 years, like 9/11, like the killing of John F. Kennedy. There are so many lies that have gone on and on and on that I would probably need to do a 24-hour video just going through them. And I'm going to talk about the truth about money in banks. You have to understand that banks are a Ponzi scheme, and how to get around them, and where to put your money, and what investing is all about during the future. And I track that pretty well from month to month, because I put out a newsletter every month for this service, and I put out a video, and I provide lots of other information like videos and articles and those types of things to keep you fully informed on what's going on. How to prepare for the challenges to come. You need to think about food. You need to think about where you live. It's going to get colder and drier, so there's a lot of things about your home that you have to protect. It's going to get much more dangerous out there in society, and you need to think about where your source of food is going to come from in the future. So all of those things I'm going to be discussing and giving you information about. So it's really, really important that you think about all those things. So how to prepare is a big deal in terms of my site. And then just the key things you can do now to ensure your future, because we really are going to have challenges next year once the market starts to implode. It's going to implode on a short-term scale here coming up fairly soon, but we're going to have an even larger crash starting next year. So you need to be ready for all of these things, and also gather around you a community of people that are like-minded and can also help you get through what is going to be a very difficult time. So you can go to thetruthsage.com and sign up for that. Also, my site at worldcyclesinstitute.com is kind of the mother site, and I post articles on that site all the time. So you can get more information on cycles and what's going on in the world, and my take on what you should be doing to prepare.